You can see that Betty is not here. This was the week she was to be in Florida taking care of our new grandson. And between coming to hear me teach or taking care of the new grandson, I came in a distant second, for sure. I want to talk with you this afternoon about John Calvin and his life. And if there's interest sometime on down the road, we can look at a different time perhaps at his legacy, what he leaves behind for the Christian church and especially for us as Presbyterians. And hopefully we'll have some time for some comments or discussion at the end. If Lutherans have their Martin Luther, and Methodists have their John Wesley, and Baptists have their Roger Williams, and Episcopalians have their Thomas Cranmer, we Presbyterians have our John Calvin. The 16th century produced some remarkably able and gifted persons. Michelangelo, Raphael, Shakespeare, Erasmus, Copernicus, Galileo, Luther, and John Calvin. Calvin is the father of our Reformed tradition. He was a scholar, pastor, preacher, teacher, reformer. His contributions to the Protestant Reformation are so significant, and you add to that his contributions to the beginnings of democracy and the beginnings of capitalism, and to my way of thinking, you have one of the most influential top 10 people in the world. It seems to me. Somebody who changed history, and someone about whom we are still talking 500 years later. Calvin was born on July the 10th, 1509 in Noyon, France, a cathedral city about 60 miles from Paris. This will make Calvin about 26 years younger than Martin Luther. Calvin is only 8 years old when Luther nails his 95 Theses up on the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517. Calvin's father's name was Gerard. He was a clerk for the cathedral and a secretary to the bishop there. His mother's name was Jean. She was the daughter of an innkeeper, and she dies when Calvin is about 5 or 6 years old. His father will remarry, and Calvin will have a brother named Antoine and a sister named Marie. Calvin's father wanted him to be a priest. So at the age of 14, Calvin goes to Paris to study. First general studies at the University of Paris, later theological studies. He's up at 4 a.m., lectures at 6 a.m., breakfast, and then more classes. And he was a marvelous student. He ate very little. He was a hard worker. He slept hardly a third of the night. He was very disciplined. This man would repeat each morning everything that he had learned the previous day in class. He enhanced his memory to an amazing power. My sense is he would have done very well in Jeopardy with a memory like that. He mastered the skills of argumentation and debate so well that his classmates nicknamed him the accusative case. He had a brilliant, logical mind. He scarcely encountered his equal. One person wrote, "He surpassed all in the perceptive faculty and strength of memory. His themes were of marvelous clearness and rare beauty of language." My guess is he had a photographic memory. One of his friends said about him years later, he could be dictating to his secretary and get interrupted for some pastoral matter, be gone for 2 hours, and come right back and pick up with his dictation exactly where he left off. So he had a computer for a mind. It's about that time that his father falls out with the church and decides that he wants John to study law. Just like today, there was more money in law than in being a priest. Wouldn't you say that, Mason? Was that way in the 16th century as well. And so Calvin then goes to Orleans, and he studies law there, and initially defends the Roman Catholic Church against the criticism of Martin Luther. Luther, as you know, was challenging the church of his day. He saw so many abuses, so much corruption, so much not done in accord with Scripture. Luther thought that the church needed to be reformed. Why did it need to be reformed? Well, church offices were being awarded by Rome to the highest bidder, which meant you had a whole lot of unqualified people serving as priests and bishops. Some offices in Germany were even sold to unborn persons. There was the sale of indulgences, money paid to get your relatives' sins forgiven so they could get out of purgatory. Some priests were openly living with women. Some priests were running gaming parlors on church property. Apparently Catholics have long liked bingo. I mean, ever since the 16th century. A lot of clergy were living lives of ease. Relics were being venerated. You had to pay money to see some bones of an apostle or the nails from the cross. The laity were embracing error and superstition. The sacraments had become polluted. The popes were tyrannical. The services were in Latin. People were worshiping images. So Luther thought that the church was corrupt and desperate and diseased. It needed to be corrected, amended, reformed, set on a new path. Well, John Calvin began to study the Bible for himself. He immersed himself in the Bible. He learned Hebrew and Greek in order to get in touch with the original languages of the Bible. He read the Gospels and Paul. He read the early church fathers, Irenaeus and Tertullian, and will quote Augustine more than any other single author. Well, Calvin's father dies, and so Calvin decides to return to his study of humanism and philosophy. In 1532, he publishes his first work, a learned commentary on the Greek writer Seneca. He demonstrates great knowledge of classical Greek and Roman authors. He struggles with the situation of the church. He writes this: "The question is not whether the church suffers from many and grievous diseases, for this is admitted even by all moderate judges, but whether the diseases are of a kind whose cure admits of no longer delay, so that it is neither useful nor proper to wait upon too slow remedies." So somewhere in 1529 or 1530, Calvin unexpectedly converts to the Protestant faith. He refers to this in his commentary on the Psalms, how God's providence stepped in and changed the direction of his life. It will not be the last time. He writes, "What happened first was that by an unexpected conversion, He, God, tamed to teachableness a mind too stubborn for its years. For I was so strongly devoted to the superstitions of the papacy that nothing less could draw me from the depths of mire. Like a flash of light, I realized in what an abyss of errors, in what chaos I was." God's merciful omnipotence was revealed to Calvin in his conversion, and he becomes deeply submitted to God's great majesty and irresistible power. In a year's time, people are coming to him, longing for a more pure doctrine, even though he refers to himself as still a beginner, a raw recruit. Calvin was earnest, persuasive, passionate, powerful. He had experienced God's mercy in Christ, and he saw the church of his day causing all kinds of pain and anguish out there in the culture, with people always doubting, not sure whether God was merciful or not. And so Calvin makes a clean break with the Roman Catholic Church. He surrenders his ecclesiastical appointment that he'd held since the age of 12, and which had provided for his education. Calvin likely co-authored a paper at this particular point by a professor of medicine at the Sorbonne University, given by a man named Nicholas Kopp, in which Kopp called upon the other university professors to obey God, and in spite of the persecution and slander they might experience from the Roman Catholic Church. Kopp had quoted Martin Luther in this paper, and so one night, as Providence would have it, Kopp and Calvin sounds like the Apostle Paul. They are let down out of a window one night using bed sheets because the sheriff was knocking on the door, and they flee. So Calvin gives up a promising future as a lawyer or a professor to take up the cause of the Reformation, which was an outlawed sect. It took some courage for this man to do that. He then goes and visits his old teachers. Oh, I'm supposed to be doing this. I'm going to show you just a couple of pictures of Calvin. I don't know if this is what a dapper man in the 16th century looked like or not, but I now come to this cartoon. Calvin goes and visits his old teachers. He tells them of his plans to help restore the church. And they caution moderation. Calvin said to them, "The building is too rotten to be patched up. It must be torn down, and in its stead a new one must be built." And his professors said back to him, "Take heed that you may not be killed by the cracking walls." In other words, being a reformer is a hard calling. And that's what we have in this little cartoon here. Lucy's talking to Linus. "Hey, Linus, in case you can't read from the back, look what I've done for you. I've made up a list of New Year's resolutions that I feel you need desperately to make. Actually, these are reforms which help you to become a better person." Linus says, "Well, how nice. This was very thoughtful of you, Lucy. I shall try earnestly to improve myself in all these areas. I'll make good use of this list. I'll try very hard to improve. I really will. In fact, I think I'm getting better already. Look at me, I'm improving." And then he just starts laughing and laughing and laughing. He throws down the piece of paper. Lucy says, "Reformers have a hard life." And they do. I think it was some quote from Machiavelli who says that, you try to change something, keep in mind you've got everybody who wants matters to stay the same is your enemy. You see. Very difficult to institute change. Well, Calvin begins to hold some secret meetings. He preaches. He assumes a different name, Charles d'Esperville. He decides to leave Paris and goes to Basel, Switzerland. And there he starts putting pen to paper. And what he will produce, the Christian religion. Never seen him in 2 volumes in English. All Presbyterian seminary students read that, or they're supposed to. In this book, Calvin means to take the Bible seriously. He will write on law, faith, prayer, sacraments, Christian liberty, the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments. He writes forcefully and clearly. He despises flowery language, unnecessarily flowery language. Apparently, Calvin must have remembered some of the teaching in his seminary days. He writes Cardinal Sadolet, and he says this, "You yourself know that it was mere sophistry, and sophistry so twisted, involved, tortuous, and puzzling, that scholastic theology might well be described as a kind of esoteric magic. The denser the darkness in which anyone shrouded a subject, and the more he puzzled himself and others with preposterous riddles, the greater his fame for acumen and learning." That's where all the discussion came about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. You see, the denser theology was back then, they thought, well, it must be great, Calvin does not like the pretentious, the ostentatious, the needlessly contrived. He favors clarity and simplicity. He publishes his first edition of the Institutes in 1536. He dedicates it to King Francis I of France, who at the time was persecuting Protestants. And Calvin pleads to the king for a fair hearing for the evangelical faith, but he does not sway the king. Next, Calvin sets out for the city of Strasbourg, where he intends to settle down to a life of scholarship. He wants to live in peace, do his research, write books, go to the library, work for progress for the Reformation. Have a nice, quiet, private life. Be careful what you wish for. On his way to Strasbourg, Calvin is barred by troops out there on the road because there's a battle up ahead, and he's got to make a detour to Geneva. He's going to spend one night in Geneva and then be on his way. But once again, God's hand of providence reaches in and changes the direction of Calvin's life. Geneva is situated on a lake. The city had already decided for the Reformation. And there's a Reformed minister there named William Farel who heard about Calvin visiting Geneva. He knows Calvin's reputation. Farel was a red-headed, freckled, fiery Reformation preacher. He was 20 years older than Calvin. He's the leader of the Reformation in Geneva. He knew the Catholics would certainly mount a counterattack, and Farel needed Calvin. He finds Calvin and he says, "We need you to teach the Scriptures to the ignorant people who hunger after salvation. I'm at the breaking point. I need help." Calvin, for his part, expressed his timidity, his weakness, his poor health, his lack of a fighting constitution. And Farel responds, "Can you stay aloof from the battle for the kingdom of God?" Calvin tried to resist Farel. Finally, Farel said, "You are not leaving. There is much for you to do." And then Farel hurled a lightning bolt. He says, "Let God damn your rest." Apparently, Pastor Farel had not taken the pastoral sensitivity course at Columbia Seminary. Farel said, "Let God damn your work." That's what he said to Calvin. And Calvin, for his part, trembled with fear. He said he felt God's presence. He had the sense that God was calling him in those moments, calling him against his own will. Calvin later wrote, "Farel kept me at Geneva not so much by advice and entreaty as by a dreadful adjuration, as if God had stretched forth his hand upon me from on high to arrest me." So all of a sudden, Calvin saw himself torn from the path that he thought he was on. He is now going to find himself on the front lines of the battle. Gone was this dream of a hidden, quiet life. Calvin yielded to a responsibility that he had not sought or wanted. He said he felt the weight of God's hand upon him, and he said, "I obey God." Now the extension of God's truth would become his passion. So Calvin stays in Geneva. He is a doctor of theology, a professor. The man didn't receive a salary for the first 5 months. That's hard on preachers. Hard on all of us. He translates his institutes into the language of the day. He begins preaching. His fame spreads. He becomes the pastor of a local church. Before long, he is engaging in debate in Lausanne with 184 Roman Catholic priests. He keeps silent for 3 days. That's again hard for preachers to do. But on day 4, as they are discussing the Lord's Supper, when the Catholics accuse the Reformers of not giving respect to the early church fathers, Calvin stood up and began quoting from his extensive memory, Tertullian and Augustine and others. And by the time he finishes, a number of the priests declare for the Reformation. I would have liked to have seen that with my own eyes. I think it's a pretty big deal when a Southern Baptist becomes a Presbyterian. Here you have Roman Catholics leaving their Roman Catholic faith and tradition and becoming Protestants. Made me wonder if Calvin might be able to convince somebody from Auburn to pull for Alabama. I'm not sure I'm not sure even an Old Testament prophet can do that. I got an Auburn friend. He hates Alabama. He says half the people in that Tuscaloosa stadium on Saturday didn't go to Alabama. He says they just pull for Alabama because they like the color red. Oh, not even Calvin could convince some of us North Carolina people to pull for Duke coming up. Won't happen. Well, Calvin, when he's in Geneva, becomes Farel's assistant. He drew up a confession of faith, the Geneva Confession. He worked on a catechism. The reformers in Geneva sought to make Geneva a theocratic state. a place where everybody lived for God's glory and God's purposes. Back then, there was no real separation of church and state. Calvin believed that worship and discipline belonged in the hands of church leaders, not in the hands of city magistrates. Those breaking God's laws in Geneva were disciplined, regardless of their rank in society. Parents were fined for not sending their children to school. Adulterous couples were led in disgrace through the city. People are coming from all over to hear Calvin preach. There were 5 worship services each Sunday in various churches there in Geneva. There were 2 sermons on each weekday. Spiritual life was sprouting everywhere in Geneva at this point. And the preachers were feeling their oats, and they wanted the citizens to swear allegiance to the confession of faith as well as to the governing body of civil government. Some Germans and Swiss refused, and they were commanded to leave the city. Others opposed this move as well, fearing foreign domination. You remember, Calvin is French, and the Germans and Swiss are concerned that these French are getting too much power. They're getting too uppity. The preachers got accused of meddling in non-spiritual matters. The politicians were threatened by the growing power of the church. And then, interestingly enough, some new elections took place in Geneva where people were elected who were hostile to Farel and Calvin. You start instituting discipline in the community like they did, you're going to create some enemies, all right? Well, there's lots of tension in Geneva at this particular point. Anarchy was feared. A 9 o'clock curfew was set. Good thing to remember, Mason, as a town commissioner. Things get out of hand. You just set a curfew on them. They've been doing it for a long time. Well, the Swiss officials in Bern were fearful that the Roman Catholic King of France would annex Geneva into his empire. So they demanded the retention of certain Christian holidays and required the use of unleavened bread in communion. That's what the Catholics did, not what the Protestants wanted to do. The local Geneva City Council agreed. However, Farel and Calvin and other Reformation preachers disagreed. They took the position that no worldly power, no civil government ought to tell the church how to administer communion. And they were going to stand on that decision. Pamphlets were circulated. The city council threatened force against the reformers. It was a rather disorderly time. Well, it was Easter Sunday, 1538. Calvin and Farel preached in the 2 main Geneva churches, but they refused to administer communion in the way the city council required. City officials then come to Calvin and Farel and ask them to yield, and they say no. And then the city authorities told them that they couldn't preach. That's going to be a tough thing for Calvin. A tumult in the streets erupts. And that night, angry fists beat on Calvin's door. They cursed him. They set their dogs on him. There were 50 musket shots fired outside his house. That'll make the preacher a little nervous there. Yet, at the appointed time to preach, Calvin mounted the pulpit in St. Peter's Church. He had had a sleepless night, but it was Easter. He needed to obey God and not man. The gospel had to be preached. Many parishioners came to church armed with swords that day. That was back when there were real Presbyterians. Calvin spoke about the prevailing controversy. For the afternoon sermon, Calvin's enemies had assembled in the Franciscan church. Over there was a fist fight, gunshots, and drawn swords. Friends protected Calvin from the mob. No blood was shed. Well, Mason, the city fathers decided to call a meeting. These preachers had preached despite being prohibited. They debated at the city council for several hours. They discussed imprisoning Calvin and Farel. Instead, they said Farel and Calvin were to leave the city in 3 days. And Calvin received the news with quiet composure. He actually said, I feel some relief. Later he would write this: "When I was chased away, I was not magnanimous enough not to enjoy my new won freedom, to enjoy it more than I could answer for. Freed from my calling, I was now permitted to live in peace without a public office." Calvin was given some shelter by a printer friend in Basel, and he decided at that point he was not going to enter any more commitments which would bring him into contact with church affairs. I assure you that Calvin was not the first or the last preacher to make such a decision. Just to say, I'm done with these people. He writes this: "Above all, I fear to return to the yoke from which I have been freed. At that time, God's call held me bound. Now I fear I would tempt God were I to assume it again, such a burden which, as I have discovered, is unbearable to me." Sounds like the man had simply had enough. He was, at this particular point in his life, without an income. A former friend of his who had returned to the Catholic fold sent him some money. That Catholic friend also told him in the letter that his expulsion from Geneva was a sign of God's disapproval of his work. Calvin sold some of his books to make ends meet. He worked on enlarging the institutes. There was some talk in Basel of creating a pastorate for him, a pastorate made up of French refugees. That seemed like a pretty good match for Calvin. Martin Bucer wanted him in Strasbourg, but at this point Calvin refused all offers. Strasbourg, however, did not give up. That's a word to the wise for search committees, it seems to me. They kept on inviting Calvin. Poverty was starting to press in on Calvin at this point. So in September of 1538, he starts out for Strasbourg. In Strasbourg, Calvin was seen as a treasure. He established a French congregation. He gave lectures in theology. He introduced church discipline. He preached 4 times a week, taught the Bible, conducted debates. His church was composed of persons who had left their country, France, for the sake of the Christian faith. Some even call Strasbourg the New Jerusalem because they found asylum and peace there from the years of slander and persecution. Here in Strasbourg, Calvin will write his first commentary on the book of Romans, saying that he who enters into this book receives the key to all the hidden treasures of Holy Scripture. In Strasbourg, Calvin did pastoral counseling. He continued writing sermons. We have about 2,000 of Calvin's sermons that are preserved today. I don't have but 1,000 of mine. Nobody's interested in reading mine. And I couldn't read his. My Carol in Westminster College in Cambridge sat right beside all these sermons of Calvin, but they were all in French. And it didn't do me much good. Calvin didn't have the courage to ask the people in Strasbourg for an income. So he sells more books and household possessions. After 8 months of being there and doing all that work, he began to receive a salary, about $1 a week, 4.3 francs. He accepted boarders into his home to make ends meet. His home was run by his brother and sister, who were even poorer than Calvin. Calvin would select his boarders. You know how he selected them? He wanted to train these young men to become future ministers of word and sacrament. That's what he did. Well, Calvin is 29 years of age at this point, and his friends thought he needed a wife. Now, here's the only time I think Calvin might have lied or fudged on the truth. He says this: "I am none of those insane lovers where they are smitten at first sight with a fine figure." I don't know what he's got against a fine figure. He said, "The grace which might capture me for a woman is discipline, gentleness, modesty, good housekeeping, and patience." And he meant to add a fine figure, but he just didn't do it. Idelette de Burgh. There she is on the right. That's somebody's picture of Idelette. She was a widow. She had come to Strasbourg and was converted by Calvin's preaching. She joins his congregation. Her husband died of the plague. Calvin did his funeral. He does the funeral of 2 of her young children. She too, though, like Calvin, was rather sickly. They had 3 children, all of whom died shortly after birth. They were married for about 9 years, and then she dies, and Calvin deeply grieves this loss. He wrote, "I have been bereaved of the best companion of my life." Back in Geneva, things had remained stormy for the 3.5 years that Calvin had been in exile. Opponents of the Reformation had put in place, after Calvin left, a bunch of weak preachers who blindly followed the dictates of the ruling party. And they lost the respect of the people. That is a deadly thing for preachers, when you lose the respect of the people. Friends of the Reformation began to win city elections and decided they would ban the losers from the city for 101 years. That's a novel political move. Only Presbyterian kind of people would think of that. We're going to lose this, y'all lose this election. We win, we're going to ban you for a century. That's what they did. Well, the city fathers in Geneva decided that they wanted Calvin back. Things had not gone so well in his absence. And so they began to send invitations to Calvin. Don't linger. Come to build up and to gladden the church which lies in misery, grief, and sorrow. Calvin could have written back and says, serves you all right, okay, but he didn't. But it frightened Calvin to think about going back to Geneva, to the place of his humiliation. Better the gallows, but not back to that agony. He did not want to bear that burden again. In Strasbourg, he could labor undisturbed. In Geneva, he knew there would only be battles. And Calvin's response to the invitations was that he would rather die 100 times than go back. Yet, they kept asking. Another word for search committees. They wrote him and said, "Come, honored Father in Christ. You belong to us. The Lord himself has given you to us. Everybody sighs for you." The city council in Geneva sent emissaries accompanied by heralds. They begged Calvin to return to Geneva. They asked Strasbourg's council to release him. And even Farel writes a letter to Calvin and hopes that he will go to Geneva. And finally, Calvin relented. He writes, "I yield, I surrender." So for the second time in his life, against his own will, but in obedience to God, Calvin returns to Geneva and takes up this heavy burden. He would later write Farel, "If I had a free choice, I would prefer to do everything else in the world than to do your will. But I know that I am not my own master. I offer my heart to the Lord in sacrifice. After I have overcome my soul and control it, it shall be subject to Him alone." That is a remarkable statement, and it sort of leads into Calvin's personal scene of a flaming heart in an open hand, and around it in Latin it would have said, "My heart I give thee, Lord, promptly and sincerely." Okay? Anybody know what the word sincerely means in Latin? You sign your name down there, sincerely, John, Gracie, whoever, sincerely. In Latin, it means without wax. What does that mean? You sign without wax. Peggy. Well, what Calvin is saying here it has something to do with gem merchants in ancient days. Gem merchants would often take imperfect gemstones back in that day. They would dip them in wax and then polish them. So the wax covered over the faults and imperfections in the stone. Okay, so what is Calvin saying? "My heart I give thee, Lord, promptly and without wax." In other words, I give it to you just as I am. Calvin knew about the sovereignty of God, and he knew, you might be able to fool your wife, or your session or your family or your church, but you couldn't fool Almighty God. He sees and knows everything. But here's a man who says, here is my heart, God. You know how infected and corrupt I am as a sinner, and yet here I give you my heart and my life. I'll do what you want me to do. That's not a bad Lenten thought when you think about it. My heart I give thee, Lord, promptly and sincerely. I have a feeling that's part of the reason why we're still talking about this man 500 years after he was born. Well, so Calvin is now 32 years old. He is sickly. He is shy. He returns to Geneva to lead the Reformation movement. He is appointed the pastor of the ancient cathedral of St. Pierre's or St. Peter's. He's provided a decent salary. He's given a large house by the lake and annual portions of 12 measures of wheat and 250 gallons of wine. That's 5 gallons a week. The water must not have been really good. But I found this great quote the other day, Psalm 104. Calvin is writing about how God takes care of, God waters the mountains and He takes care of the bread and everything and that people need. But and he also mentions wine. And he says, nature would certainly be satisfied with water to drink, and therefore the addition of wine is owing to God's superabundant liberality. That's a great line. But they gave him 250 gallons of wine a year. They also gave him a new robe of black velvet trimmed with fur, which is why sometimes you see pictures of him with that fur there. Well, Calvin's trip back to Geneva was not without some doubts in his mind and some sighs. In his preface to the Psalms, he writes this: when I returned to the flock from which I had been torn, I did so with sadness, tears, foreboding, and anxiety of heart. God and a few friends are witnesses of this, and they would like to have spared me this sorrow. For although I would have offered my life for the welfare of the Genevan church, my shyness continued to whisper good reasons into my ear why I should not carry this burden again. Well, the council and the people received Calvin with open arms. Some of them are there, no doubt, have guilty consciences. Farel would not have spared his enemies. Some of Calvin's enemies, no doubt, expected to be humiliated when he returns. And as you can well imagine, people crowded in to hear Calvin's first sermon back in that pulpit. They were expecting fireworks. Somebody's going to get lit up in this service, and I don't want to miss it, okay? Well, Calvin climbed into that pulpit, he opened the Bible, and he simply began preaching exactly where he had left off 3.5 years before. It would be like, well, when I was here last, we were in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 3. I pick up at Ephesians chapter 4, verse 4. It was remarkable, and it showed that he had been forced to give up the preaching office. He had never abandoned it. But there's no revenge here. Not a word about the past. Not a word about his adversaries who expelled him 3.5 years before like a common criminal. He gave no insult to them. He probably had power enough then to have a lot of them removed from office. But he didn't do any of that. He wanted to demonstrate that he would be everybody's pastor. And this was new for the city of Geneva. It made a good impression on the people. Calvin was grateful for the victory which Christ had won in his heart, his submissive heart, dedicated to God, over the desires for revenge. But even with that, things would not be easy in Geneva. Calvin had difficulty sleeping. He was high-strung. Henry, listen to this list. This all didn't happen at one point, but in his lifetime, he was a terribly sick man, which I can't get over how much he accomplished with all of these illnesses. He had these terrible headaches. He had pleurisy, consumption, hemorrhoids, parasites, an internal abscess, gallstones, gout, kidney stones, stomach cramps, arthritis, and asthma. He took only one meal a day because of his stomach trouble, and 5 years prior to his death, he was spitting up blood. He probably had tuberculosis. And yet, each month for a 2-week period, he preached every day. He gave 3 theology lectures a week, assisted all the deliberations of the consistory. The consistory is like a session. It's ministers and elders. They met on Thursday afternoons, and they're going to institute discipline in the church and in the community. He attended, in essence, presbytery meetings. He wrote books. He carried on voluminous correspondence. He took in some friends. He had a friend who died. He brings their children into his house. He visited those with the plague. He visited lackadaisical members. He was on the executive committee that examined physicians. I'd like to do that, Henry. He worked to bring a cloth and velvet mill to Geneva when unemployment skyrocketed. You know why? This is why Presbyterians have always been involved in their community, you see. We're in essence following what Calvin did way on back. He composed a catechism in Latin and French and later translated it into German, English, Spanish, Italian, and Greek. He helped frame the laws of Geneva because of his training as a lawyer. And Geneva, Switzerland to this day, is a fairly neat place. They make good watches and chocolate, make a lot of money. All that comes from Calvin as far as I'm concerned. He presented the church with liturgy for worship. He laid out instructions for how to do baptisms and the Lord's Supper. He established a school and a seminary. Seminary had 900 students in it from all over the world. He wrote commentaries on most books of the Bible. He helped resettle French refugees who were escaping persecution in France. He established a hospital for the sick. He set up a garbage collection system. He did it because why? Rats are spreading bubonic plague. He did a very Presbyterian thing. He got a committee together. How are we going to stop this, you see? And they pulled it off. He instituted discipline through the consistory in the church and in the community. They prohibited dancing, the singing of lewd songs. They prohibited statues, relics, organs, altars, candles, the wearing of rouge and lace, swearing, gambling, playing cards, drunkenness, naming children after Catholic saints. I read one thing where, you have that service. You say, what is the Christian name of this child? They give a Catholic saint's name, and the man baptizes the baby with a non-Catholic name, and they about have a riot in the church that day in Geneva. If you look at the consistory cases where there were discipline instituted, people were disciplined for relapses to Catholicism, blasphemy, for complaining about Calvin, immorality, gambling, insulting French immigrants, dancing, singing, obscene songs, absence from worship, and catechetical teaching. The consistory was Calvin's way of trying to institute God's authority and the church's authority in the lives of the people. But it was a controversial institution. Not a whole lot of that kind of discipline instituted in 2022 relative to the 16th century. Discipline came to Calvin's own house when his sister-in-law was found guilty of adultery with Calvin's servant. He'd also been stealing from Calvin. Calvin's stepchild, Judith, over whom Calvin was the guardian, committed adultery after her mother's death. And Calvin wrote, "These things nearly crushed me." In 1556, John Knox of Scotland travels 800 miles to Geneva to consult with Calvin. He said Calvin had a long nose, wispy beard, pallid complexion, and brilliant eyes. He quickly becomes Calvin's disciple. He heard him preach, he sought his advice, and Knox will write this: "Here exist in Geneva the most perfect school of Christ, which has been since the days of the apostles on earth. In other places I confess Christ to be truly preached, but manners and religion so sincerely reformed I have not seen in any other place. Knox saw in Geneva a truly godly society where respect for God and neighbor was lived out. Well, after laboring there in Geneva for 22 years, Calvin was invited to become a citizen of Geneva in 1559. He had not brought it up before, lest he be suspected of seeking his own interest. Well, on Christmas Day, 1559, after much work, Calvin begins to spit up blood. He's advised to go home and rest a month. He rested for a few days and then went back to work. The physicians did all that they could, but he's going to die slowly over the next several years. He preaches his last sermon on February the 6th, 1564. He's almost not able to finish it because of difficulty with breathing. He goes home and goes to bed. He dictated correspondence. He refused a monetary gift from the city council, he said, because I wasn't able to work for it. Calvin apparently didn't understand the difference between a wage and a gift. 2 weeks later, his friends will carry him to City Hall, where Calvin says goodbye and where he gives thanks for all the kindnesses shown to him. The next Sunday was Easter, and he wanted to share communion with his congregation. They carried him in. He stays through the sermon and the hymn, and he's able to sing with the congregation that day the Nunc Dimittis. Lord, let us now thy servant depart in peace. Very appropriate last hymn for the man. He dictates his will on April the 25th. The whole city is praying for him. He had given them everything he had. He dies a month later on May the 27th, 1564 at about 8 o'clock in the evening. There was great mourning in Geneva at Calvin's death. He gave specific instructions for his funeral. His funeral was not to be any different than any other citizen there. His body was sewn into a white shroud and laid in a simple pine coffin. A multitude of people followed that coffin to his grave. He didn't want a tombstone because he didn't want his grave to become a kind of Protestant shrine. Well, let me close with a quote of one of Calvin's students. I got a couple here, but I'll just share one. It says, Calvin dies, and one is hardly aware of his passing. Everything remains quiet. In peace and absolute order, he takes leave of state and church. The dough is kneaded. He who kneaded is no more. But irresistibly the dough rises. The leaven works in many lands for centuries, even yonder in the New World. Brightly shines the only epitaph which he might have desired. Sola Deo Gloria. To God alone be the glory.